The Business House motion just agreed to by the House provides for motions number 3 and number 4 on today's order paper to be debated together, but the question will be put separately on each motion as the end of the debate. I now call the Prime Minister to move motion number 3, with which the House will debate number 4. Prime Minister!
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that these regulations now be approved, and I want to begin by telling the House I was hugely encouraged by a visit I paid only yesterday to a vaccine plant in North Wales, where I saw for myself the vials of one of 7 vaccines backed by the UK government that could turn the tide of our struggle against COVID, not just in this country, but around the world. It is the protection of those vaccines that could get our economies moving again and allow us to reclaim our lives. And that one plant in Wrexham could produce 300 million doses a year. And yesterday was the momentous day when it began to manufacture the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. And it was a very moving moment, Mr. Speaker, because I talked to one of the brilliant young scientists there, and she described the most extraordinary moment for her in her life to be part of an enterprise that was, she thought, truly going to offer humanity a route out of this suffering. But, Mr. Speaker, we have to be realistic, and we have to accept that this vaccine is not here yet. No vaccine is here yet. And while all the signs are promising, and almost every scientist I've talked to agrees that the breakthrough will surely come, we do not yet have one that has gained regulatory approval. And we can't be completely sure when the moment will arrive. And until then, we cannot afford to relax, especially during the cold months of winter. The national measures, which are now shortly ending in England, have eased the burden on the NHS and begun to reverse the advance of the virus. Today, the R is back below 1, and the ONS survey is showing that signs of the infection rate are levelling off. Imperial College London has found that the number of people with COVID has fallen by 1/3 in England since the 2nd of November. But while the virus has been contained, it has not been eradicated. The latest ONS figures suggest that out of every 85 people in England, 1 has coronavirus, far more than in the summer. Between 24th November and yesterday, 3,222 people across the UK lost their lives. And despite the immense progress of the last 4 weeks, our NHS remains under pressure, with hospitals in 3 regions, the South West, the North, East and Yorkshire, all treating more COVID patients now than at the peak of the first wave. And I give way to the honourable gentleman.
And I thank the Prime Minister for giving way. He did talk about the virus being eradicated. Only one virus in history has been eradicated. Containment may well be the only option open to us.
The honourable gentleman is, of course, completely right, and it is containment that is the objective of the tiering scheme that the government is announcing, which I hope that the benches opposite will support tonight, in spite of what I gather is their decision to abstain, which seems extraordinary to me. So we can't simply allow the current restrictions to expire for the reason he gives, with no replacement whatever. With the spread of the epidemic varying across the country, there remains a compelling case. For regional tiers in England, and indeed, Mr. Speaker, a compelling necessity for regional tiers. And I give way to my honourable friend.
Thank him very much. Our latest rate is 79 per 100,000. A week ago, it was 178. We went in tier 1, we've come out in tier 2. My pubs and restaurants are in the worst of all worlds. I wonder, in asking me to support these regulations tonight, what hope the Prime Minister can give to them.
Prime Minister.
Well, indeed, Mr. Speaker, and I will be coming in just a moment to what we're going to be doing, what more we hope to be doing for pubs and restaurants and everybody in the hospitality sector, whose anguish and whose difficulties I think everybody in this chamber, Mr. Speaker, understands and appreciates. But I hope the House is clear what I'm not asking for today. This is not another lockdown, nor is this the renewal of existing measures in England. The tiers that I am proposing would mean that from tomorrow, everyone in England, including those in Tier 3, will be free to leave their homes for any reason. And when they do, they'll find the shops open for Christmas, the hairdressers open, the nail bars open, gyms, leisure centres, swimming pools open, and I give way to my honourable friend.
Thank the Prime Minister for giving way. My constituency of Workington sits entirely within the borough of Allerdale, where our rates have declined to a point just over 70, currently in Tier 2 restrictions. Will he commit to a more local tiering system so that the hard work of my constituents is rewarded?
Well, yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker, and I know that this is a point that many of my honourable and right honourable friends have made to me and to the government with great force and eloquence over the last few days. We do want to be as granular as possible as we go forward to reflect the reality of the epidemic and the human geography of the epidemic, and we shall. But what I can say from tomorrow, Mr. Speaker, is that across the country, across the whole country, as I say, not just gyms and leisure centres and swimming pools, but churches, synagogues, mosques and temples will be open for communal worship. Organised outdoor sport will resume. And in every tier, you will be able to meet others in parks and in public gardens, subject to the rule of 6. And every one of those things has been, by necessity, restricted until today. Every one of them to be allowed again tomorrow. And of course, I accept that this is not a return to normality. I wish it was so. But it is a bit closer to normality than the present restrictions. And what we can't do is to lift all the restrictions at once or move too quickly in such a way that the virus would begin to spread rapidly again. And that would be the surest way of endangering our NHS and forcing us into a New Year lockdown with all the costs that would impose. And I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank the Prime Minister, and after the inconsistencies and controversies of the previous tiering system, what was required this time round was more fairness, clarity and transparency, and we were promised a regional approach. However, what the powers of be have done is that they have placed little old Slough in Tier 3, despite the fact that we have been segregated from the wider region, and there are areas in neighbouring London and Essex with higher COVID transmission rates. So why does the Prime Minister hate Slough? What have we done that has annoyed him so much?
Well, I mean, I love Slough, and I take that. But I understand what he's saying, and I appreciate people's feelings of injustice, and people do feel it. There's no question. People feel that they've been unfairly attracted by proximity into a higher tier than they deserve, and people also feel that the tiering is not working for them. Well, I just want to repeat the answer I gave to my honourable friend from Workington, which is that as we go forward, and I mean this very sincerely, the government will look at how we can reflect as closely as possible the reality of what is happening on the ground for local people, looking at the incidence of the disease, looking at the human geography and spread of the pandemic, and indeed the progress that areas are making in getting the virus down. And we will try to be as sensitive as possible to local effort and to local achievement in bringing that pandemic under control. And if I'll just make a little bit of progress, Mr. Speaker, because I want to say something now about our hospitality sector, which I know the House will want to hear. Because we all accept that the burden on the hospitality sector has been very great. And we feel this deeply because our pubs, our hotels, restaurants, they're in many ways the heart of our communities and part of the fabric of our identity as a country. And everybody can see that the hospitality industry has borne a disproportionate share of the burden in this crisis. There's no question about it. And that is obviously because we want to keep schools open, Mr. Speaker, and we have to take such measures as we can. I would just remind the House, however, that we're not alone in this. In France, bars, restaurants and gyms will not reopen until January the 20th at the earliest. In Germany, the hospitality sector will remain closed in its entirety over Christmas. But we will do everything in our power to support our hospitality sector throughout this crisis. We've already extended the furlough scheme for all businesses until the end of March. We've provided monthly grants of up to £3,000 for premises forced to close and £2,100 for those that remain open but have suffered because of reduced demand. We've allocated £1.1 billion for local authorities to support businesses at particular risk. And today, Mr. Speaker, we're going further with a one-off payment of £1,000 in December to wet pubs. That's pubs, Mr. Speaker, that do not serve food, as the House knows, recognising how hard they've been hit by this virus in what is typically their busiest month. We will also work with the hospitality sector in supporting their bounce back next year. Mr. Speaker, I want to stress that the situation is profoundly different now because there is an end in sight. And I'm not this afternoon seeking open-ended measures. On the contrary, these regulations come with a sunset clause at the end of February, and at that point, at the end of the 2nd of February, I should say, Mr. Speaker. And at that point, we will have sufficient, at the end of the 2nd of February, we will have sufficient data to assess our position after Christmas. And though I believe these types of restrictions will be needed until the spring, they can only be extended beyond the 2nd of February if this House votes for them, Mr. Speaker, and I give way with pleasure to my...
Market Raisin Ward in the week up to 25th of November, 6 cases to go to Tier 3. East Ham Ward in London, 40 cases in that week to go into Tier 2. So what I want from my right honourable friend is an absolute personal commitment that he and his honourable friend, the Secretary of State, will look at this personally in the case of Lincolnshire, and they will do their level best to get us out of Tier 3 by Christmas.
Indeed, Mr. Speaker, I can certainly give my right honourable friend that assurance that we will look in as much granular detail as we can at the incidents throughout the country. But I wish, and these are points that have been made with great power, as I say, by honourable members on all sides of the House. We'll review the allocation of tiers every 14 days, starting on the 16th of December. And I just want to make an important point to my right honourable friend and to all members who are rightly concerned about the position of their constituencies, our constituencies, in these tiers. Honourable members have it in their powers, in our power, to help move our areas down the tiers by throwing their full weight, Mr. Speaker, throwing our full weight as leaders in our communities behind community testing and seizing the opportunity to encourage as many people as possible to take part. And I give way with pleasure to my right honourable.
I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister for giving way. Kent is the biggest county by population in Britain, and there are vast differences in the rate of COVID within it. In Tunbridge Wells, we have one of the lowest incidences in the country. So will the Prime Minister commit that at the first possible review on the 16th of December, if a particular borough meets the 5 criteria that he's set, he will move it down to a lower tier for that particular borough?
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, and he's quite right to raise the position of Tunbridge Wells, and the feelings of the people of Tunbridge Wells, I know, are shared by many people across the country who feel this sense of, as I say, being unjustly attracted into the wrong level of tiering. And I repeat the assurance I've given to my honourable friend from Workington and Gainsborough House. We will look in granular detail, Mr. Speaker, at local incidents, look at the human geography of the pandemic, and take account of exactly what is happening every 2 weeks, as I say. And it is in the power of honourable members, to repeat my point, to help their local area move down the tiers. I'm going to give way, I think, for one last time, Mr. Speaker, to the right honourable gentleman.
I'm very grateful for the Prime Minister giving way. We ensure that anyone who wants to take a test to confirm that they don't have the virus before they visit family members over Christmas can have a test on the NHS.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're rolling out lateral flow testing across the country, and it is open to people to get a lateral flow test. But in general, the testing system is available at the moment for people who have symptoms. But I would urge people who are worried that they may need to be in company of those who are elderly or vulnerable to seek to get a rapid turnaround test. And may I suggest to him that one thing he could do for his constituents, if he wants to help them move out of the tier that they are in, is to encourage them all to take part in mass community testing, of a kind that the government is rolling out. And it depends very much on the cooperation of local leaders and local authorities of the kind that we've seen in Liverpool, Mr. Speaker, where since the 6th of November, over 284,000 tests have been conducted, and together with the effect of national restrictions, the number of cases fell by more than 2/3. And this is the model that I would recommend. We're now proposing that from tomorrow, Liverpool City region and Warrington should be in tier 2, whereas previously, obviously, they were in tier 3. And we want other regions and other towns, cities, communities to follow this path. And that's why, with the help of our fantastic armed forces, we'll be offering community testing to tier 3 areas as quickly as possible. Mr. Speaker, let me just say, I'll give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister. What assessment has he done of compliance with previous lockdowns? And does he share my concern that people have just had enough and that the risk of non-compliance is very great, and that those who are compliant will then have the added frustration of watching those who won't comply doing whatever they want whilst they have to sit at home?
Well, Mr. Speaker, normally I find myself in agreement with my right honourable friend, but I must say I don't think that she's right in this instance, because if you look at what the British people have achieved in the last few weeks by following the guidance, by deciding to work together to get the R down, they have done just that, Mr. Speaker. Collectively, the people of this country have got the R back down below 1. That wasn't by non-compliance, Mr. Speaker. That was by the people of this country deciding to follow the rules, do it together, and get the virus down. And I would just say, Mr. Speaker, that I find it extraordinary that the official opposition, represented by the gentleman opposite, currently have no view on the way ahead and are not proposing to vote tonight. Perhaps he'd like to tell us.
Well, I'm very pleased to hear it. Many of us on this side believe that there should be restrictions, but believe that the Prime Minister's tiers are wrong. He's explaining very well there why he's going to come back on the 16th of December and come up with a system that we might be able to vote for. But the system he's coming up with today is totally inadequate. How is it possible that in Chesterfield, with 118 per 100,000, we're in tier 3, but in London constituencies that he represents, a much higher level are in tier 2? It's because our pub owners and our restaurateurs aren't worth it to him.
Mr. Speaker, I hope that the honourable gentleman will really think carefully about what he's just said. We're trying to look after pubs, restaurants, businesses across this entire country. And no one feels the anguish of those businesses more than this government. And I do think, however, it is extraordinary that in spite of the barrage of criticism that we have no credible plan from the party opposite. Indeed, we have no view. We have no view on the way ahead. It's a quite extraordinary thing, Mr. Speaker, that tonight, to the best of my knowledge, the right honourable gentleman opposite, who said he's always going to act in the national interest, has told his party to sit on its hands and to abstain in the vote tonight, Mr. Speaker. And I think The government has made its decision. We've taken some tough decisions, Mr. Speaker, and the Labour opposition has decided tonight heroically to abstain, Mr. Speaker. And I think when the history of this pandemic comes to be written, I think the people of this country will observe that instead of having politicians of all parties coming together in the national interest, they had one party taking the decisions, another party heroically deciding to abstain, Mr. Speaker. In the story of 2020, I think there are two great feats in which we can take a great deal of comfort. First, our country has come together in an extraordinary effort that has so far succeeded in protecting our NHS and in saving many lives. And while our scientists have been zeroing in on the weaknesses of COVID, telescoping 10 years of work into 10 months, and now their endeavours are about to deliver the means, as I say, to rout the virus. Then that is clear. The government is backing not one potential vaccine, but 7. We've ordered 100 million doses of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine that's now seeking regulatory approval. We've ordered 7 million doses of the Moderna vaccine, which has almost 95% effectiveness in trials. And, Mr. Speaker, we've ordered 40 million doses of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, which, if approved by the regulator, could start being administered before Christmas. In total, Mr. Speaker, no, I'm coming there. In total, Mr. Speaker, our vaccines task force has secured more than 350 million doses, more than enough for everyone in the UK, the Crown dependencies, and our overseas territories. All we need to do now, Mr. Speaker, is to hold our nerve until these vaccines are indeed in our grasp and indeed being injected into our arms. So I say to the House again, let us follow the guidance. Let us roll out mass testing. Let's work to deliver mass testing to the people of our country. Let's work together to control the virus. And it is in that spirit that I commend these regulations, Mr. Speaker. I commend these regulations to the House.
The question is that motion number 3, as on the order paper, can I just say to members, I will be introducing a 4-minute time limit, but I now go to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by welcoming the fall in infection numbers, the drop in the number of people being admitted to hospital, and crucially that the national R rate is now below 1, and below 1 in many parts of the country. That is very welcome news across the House. Before the lockdown, the infection rate was doubling every 2 weeks. The R number was above 1 in every part of England and rising, and the number of people in hospital was going up sharply across the country. In other words, the virus had been allowed to get out of control. And if anyone doubts that a lockdown was necessary, I would point out that since the 2nd of November, when this lockdown started, 10,711 people have tragically died within 28 days of testing positive for COVID-19. In the last week alone, that's an average of 460 deaths per day. That's appalling numbers, and every one is a tragedy. So we can argue about why this lockdown didn't happen earlier, when the infection rate was lower, as we argued for on this side of the House. But whatever view was taken of the timing, it's clear that the lockdown was necessary and has helped to reduce infections. Mr. Speaker, can I also welcome the progress on vaccines? I have nothing but admiration for our scientists and the amazing progress that's been made. And this is a great moment for our scientists. I myself went to Oxford University week before last to see the vaccine group there and to see the remarkable work that they were doing just before they announced their results. So a vaccine may now be in sight, and we must do everything we can to encourage take-up and make sure that it's rolled out quickly, fairly and safely. But, Mr. Speaker, the questions before this House today are these. How can we save as many lives and livelihoods as possible until we reach the light at the end of that tunnel? And are the measures that the Prime Minister has announced today going to control the virus and provide the right support to communities worst affected by these restrictions. Now, Labour has supported the government in 2 national lockdowns, and I recognise the need for continuing restrictions. And I do recognise that the tiers have been toughened, as it was obvious to everyone that the previous tiers were a one-way street to tier 3. But I'm far from convinced by what the Prime Minister has said today. In particular, the economic package is nowhere near sufficient to support the communities most affected, and they've been suffering for many months. I'll just make some progress and I'll come back. I also fear that without the right health measures in place, in particular a working trace and isolate system, there are real risks that this plan is incapable of controlling the virus this winter. And I want to set that out in a bit more detail. Before I do so, I'll give way.
I'll thank the Leader of the Opposition. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that support for businesses, especially in Tier 3, who are struggling in the hospitality and in the arts sector in specifically, is just not enough because many of them are on the brink of collapse?
Just say to everybody in the chamber, with lots of speakers, those who are on early intervening is not fair to those later. People who aren't good to speak, I do understand, need to intervene. But please, let's think about each other. Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I do agree, and I'll come to the business support in a minute. But let me make the points in support of the case we make today. And the first point is this, that we've been here before. On the 10th of June, the Prime Minister told us for the first time of his whack-a-mole strategy to control local infections, the 10th of June. He told us it would be so effective that restrictions would only be for a few weeks or even a few days. That was far from reality. Leicester, for example, has just gone into the 154th day of restrictions, and by the time these regulations run out on the 2nd of February, Leicester will have been in restrictions for 217 days. So that didn't work, that 10th June proposal. I will in just 1 minute. Roll on to the 22nd of September. By now, infections rising in 19 of the 20 areas then under restrictions. The Prime Minister announced new restrictions, including the rule of 6. He stood and he told the House, and I quote, that the rule of 6, he said this, will curb the number of daily infections and reduce the reproduction rate to below 1. That's what he said about the rule of 6. So that didn't work. 2 weeks later, 12th of October, precise opposite happening, the Prime Minister stands up again, third time, introduces a 3-tier system. Again, he said this will work. He told the House this will deliver the reduction in the R rate locally and regionally that we need. That didn't work. 19 days later, 4th attempt now, a hurried press conference on a Saturday, the Prime Minister announced that the tier system had failed, the virus was out of control, and a national lockdown was now unavoidable. The reason this all matters, Mr. Speaker, because there's a pattern here. The Prime Minister's got a record of over-promising and under-delivering short-term decisions that then bump into the harsh reality of the virus. And then a new plan is conjured up a few weeks later. We're now on at least the 5th, with an even bigger promise that never materialises. Now, after 8 months, the Prime Minister should not be surprised that we and many of the British people are far less convinced this time round. I will give way.
I thank the honourable gentleman, right honourable gentleman, hugely. I have a biology degree, and I'm going to take a wild punt that I'm one of the few members of this House that actually used the word epidemiology in anger before January this year. We have choices to control this virus. We can have a lockdown, we can have a tiered system, or we can have no lockdown, where lives like John and Ken, who we've just recently lost in my family to this awful COVID, have happened. Why will the right honourable gentleman of the Labour Party not support these measures that are saving lives tonight?
Well, I'm grateful for that intervention. I'm setting out exactly why not, and I will take interventions along the way so that what I say can be challenged. But the first point is, which I've just finished, that we have been here before. This is at least plan number 5, and the first 4 haven't worked. So I think everybody would forgive the British public for being sceptical about the 5th plan. And I will go on to set out, because the second point I want to make is this. The public health risk of the Prime Minister's approach is significant. The prevalence of the virus remains high. Even if the R rate is below 1, it's only just below 1. And we know that the virus is at its most deadly during the cold winter months, exactly when the NHS is under the most strain. So if we're to keep the R rate below 1 during winter and not waste the progress that's been made in the last 4 weeks, we need to proceed with precision and caution. But instead of levelling with the British public, the Prime Minister has spent the weekend telling his backbenchers that the plan is all about, in his words, loosening restrictions across the country. And he's been fuelling a promise that within 2 weeks or so, local areas have a real prospect of dropping from tier 1, to a tier below the one that they're in. We need to level. In my view, that is highly unlikely. And we might as well face that now.
Will you give way?
It is obvious that the new tier 1 may slow, but it won't prevent a rise in infections, and is far from certain that the new tier 2 can hold the rate of infection. I hear the mutterings, but let's just see where we are in 2 weeks. And I look across the House to members across the House who think that perhaps in 2 weeks their area is going to drop down a tier just before Christmas. Let's see. This isn't hindsight. I'm telling you what's going to happen in 2 weeks. Now, we know where we will be. We know where we'll be in 2 weeks, and I've no doubt there'll be members on the opposite side getting up and saying, I thought my area was going to drop a tier just before Christmas. That's not levelling. That's not being straight, because that is not going to happen. Tier 1, the new tier 1 may slow the rate of infection, but it won't prevent it increasing. And tier 2 will struggle to hold the rate of infection. I hope it does. I hope I stand here and I'm wrong about this. And I think all members hope I'm wrong about it. But tier 2...
Oh, order. Mr. Sambrook, it's a continuous... We've had it for a few weeks now. Let's have a rest today. Keir Starmer.
Tier 2 crucially depends on all other factors falling into place at exactly the same time. And although everybody will welcome the chance to see our loved ones at Christmas, I'm not convinced the government's got a sufficiently robust plan in place to prevent a spike in infections over the new year. Now, of course, this is difficult, and all systems would have risk. But that brings me to my third point. The risks we face today, in the decisions we make today, are much higher because the Prime Minister has failed to fix the major problems with the now £22 billion track and trace system. Before the Prime Minister simply brushes the point aside again, let me remind him and the House that one of the major reasons that SAGE advised a circuit break back in September was because track and trace was only having, in their words, a marginal impact on transmission. So the great thing that was going to control the virus wasn't working then. And if we're to control this virus, that really matters. And the Prime Minister having his head in the sand isn't helping. Now, I know the Prime Minister will say we've made advances in testing. I recognise that, and I genuinely hope it helps to tackle the virus. But let me quote the Chief Scientific Officer, who said this: testing is important. Testing is important, but of course it only matters if people isolate as well. That's blindingly obvious. But only a fraction of people who should be self-isolating are doing so. And the Prime Minister still hasn't addressed the reasons for this, including the huge gaps in support. I know that there's been an announcement about the change of those notified by the app, a ridiculous submission in the first place, but it doesn't affect basic eligibility. Only 1 in 8 workers qualify for the one-off £500 self-isolation support. 1 in 8 qualify for that support. Anyone not receiving that has to rely on statutory sick pay, which is the equivalent of £13 a day. That is a huge problem that needs to be addressed. People want to do the right thing, but for many, there's a real fear that self-isolation means a huge loss of income that they simply can't afford. Now, I think, and I can't prove this, that one of the main reasons that people aren't passing on their contacts in the way we want is because they fear that those that they are passing on the contacts for won't be able to afford to self-isolate. That is a real problem, and we can't carry on ignoring it. I will.
The right honourable gentleman is doing a very good job. It's his job to criticise the government. And of course mistakes will be made, but a credible opposition has a plan of its own. What is the plan of the Labour Party?
It's your second bite of the cherry. Is other people as well, please? Just stop.
I'll come to that, but I need to... I've accepted the case for restrictions. We were very clear about the need for a circuit break. We need to go into restrictions, but we need a scheme that works. And I'm explaining what the problem is with this scheme as we go through it. Because let me stay with track and trace. Because we know the claims the Prime Minister made about this at the beginning of the year and the middle of the year. Because on tracing, crucial, tracing, the latest figures show 137,000 close contacts were missed by the system in 1 week. That's the highest weekly figure yet. This is not a figure that's going down. It's a figure that's going up. That means that over 500,000 close contacts have been missed by the system in the last month. That's not a statistic. That's 500,000 people who should have been self-isolating, but instead of self-isolating, they were with their friends, their families, and their communities. 500,000 people in 1 month. That is a huge gap in the defences. I raise this every week. The Prime Minister pretends it's getting better, but it never does. The Prime Minister's almost given up on this now and put mass testing in its place. Again, blind optimism, not a plan. But the idea that we can go through the next few months and successfully keep the virus under control when 500,000 people a month are wandering around when they should be self-isolating is not a sensible plan going forward. My fourth point is to come to the level of economic support that's provided. I have to say to the Prime Minister, it's hard to overstate the level of anger there is about this out there in our communities, many of whom have been in restrictions for months on end. Yesterday, I did a virtual visit to the Northwest, to local businesses there. Their emotions range from deep disappointment of the government to raw anger that the Prime Minister and Chancellor just aren't listening and don't get the impact of months of endless restrictions and the impact they've had on local communities. In March, the Prime Minister vowed, the Chancellor vowed to do whatever it takes to support households and businesses. But there's now been 6 economic plans in 9 months, and the level of support is still insufficient. For these reasons, and let me spell them out. The Prime Minister mumbles. Let me spell out. First, the scheme doesn't fairly reflect the difficulties faced in businesses across the country. I'd be surprised if members' offices aren't picking this up from their constituents and businesses. Let me start with the additional restrictions grant, which gives a flat figure to local areas regardless of how long they've been in restrictions. So that means Greater Manchester, which will be on its 40th day of severe restrictions when it enters Tier 3 tomorrow, has received the same one-off support as the Isle of Wight, which went into restrictions far later and will emerge tomorrow into Tier 1. That is unfair, and everybody knows it's unfair, and everybody in this House is being told by their constituents and by their businesses that it's unfair. So to pretend it isn't there just isn't real, Prime Minister. The second aspect, I'll come to that aspect, the second aspect is this. The grant doesn't take account of the number of businesses that need support in each area. So our great cities are being asked to spread the same sum far more thinly. And that's also clearly unfair. Our constituents know it's unfair. Our businesses know it's unfair. And nothing has been done about it. The third aspect, even allowing for today's announcement on pubs, which I think is the definition of small beer, many businesses are now receiving less support than they did during the first wave. That's a huge strain for businesses, particularly those that have been so long under restrictions. And it makes no economic sense for the government to allow them to go to the wall. The second, putting the grant system on one side, the second major point about the economic support is this, that millions of self-employed people remain unfairly excluded from the government support schemes. Again, there's nothing that's been done about this. I've raised it so many times with the Prime Minister, so have others. Every time he chooses to talk about those that are within the scheme, ignoring those that are not in the scheme. This is 8 months on, and we're facing another 3 or 4 months of this, which means 12 months without the support that's needed in those areas. I will.
Extremely grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way. He talks about those people who have been excluded from support and focusing in on who those people are. They include people who set up their own businesses 18 months ago, directors of very small limited companies, taxi drivers, hairdressers and the like. These are the entrepreneurs we need to build Britain back as we recover from the economic wreckage of the coronavirus. Does he agree with me? We should be investing in those people, not excluding them and leaving many of them in deep and dangerous debt.
I do, and their cry still hasn't been heard. Now, I accept that in putting together a support package in a hurry back in March, there may have been reasons why certain groups were overlooked. But this is 8 months on. This has been pointed out over and over again. And here we go into a tiered system, and there's still that gap in the system, and it's being very strongly felt out there. The third point about the economic package is this, that the government must remove the uncertainty about furlough and rule out changing the scheme again in January. This is crucial because businesses are beginning to make decisions about what they do in January. The Chancellor made this mistake before. By the time the furlough was extended, many businesses had laid people off because it came too late. We know what happens in this circumstance. The uncertainty has already caused real economic damage, and we can't afford the same mistake again. So taken together, the business and economic support just doesn't stack up. I want to make a wider point about the economic damage that this pandemic and the government have done to our economy. Last week's autumn statement laid bare the huge and worsening economic cost of the crisis. I know that there are those that say, well, that's the reason to end restrictions. But the reality is you can't protect the economy if you lose control of the virus. That just leads to more uncertainty, more restrictions, and more long-term damage to the economy. And it's the failure to get control of the virus or take a long-term approach to shielding our economy that's left the UK with the worst economic recession of the G7 and the highest death toll in Europe. The fifth reason for scepticism about the government's approach is this: managing and priorities. The last 48 hours have been a summary of the mistakes the government's made in this crisis. The Prime Minister is fatally split between appeasing his backbenchers and following the science, and he's ending up pleasing nobody. I think the Prime Minister knows that tough restrictions are now needed, but he pretends that the restrictions might not be in place for very long. He pretends that it's quite possible that everybody will be in a lower tier in 2 weeks' time. The reality is that tough restrictions will be needed until the vaccine is rolled out. That may be months away. The Prime Minister will doubtless be back in a few weeks with another plan, but the Prime Minister doesn't make that case today or provide the certainty or the consistency that we need. So in the last 48 hours, we've had concessions, letters and promises to his MPs, not clear and reliable messaging to the public, and that's symptomatic of the problem. Mr. Speaker, coronavirus remains a serious threat to the public's health, to our economy and to our way of life. We recognise the need for continued restrictions, but it's not in the national interest to vote these restrictions down today, and we will allow these restrictions to pass. But it's another wasted... Well, we accept the case for restrictions. We want a plan that's going to work. We're on Plan 5, and this one's full of holes. We have been there so many times. So many times the Prime Minister stood there and said, this is the plan, this is the plan, this will solve the problem. Fifth time round, still a plan, with holes that have been there for months and still not closed. Why is track and trace still not working? Why are the gaps in the support still there? Why are those that are excluding not included? Why are those that have to self-isolate not given the support to do so? These are huge gaps in the system, and to simply vote through a plan without recognising those problems is not going to help. Now, I accept the case for restrictions. We will not stand in the way of these regulations. We do not want the restrictions to come off, but I'm not going to stand here and pretend, as the Prime Minister does, that this is the plan that's going to solve it all. Vote for this, and it'll all be fine through to Easter. That is not going to happen, and nobody should vote on that basis today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Sir Bernard Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I have to say that while there are many points of merit that the Right Honourable Gentleman has just raised, he's left the House and the public with the impression that he is happy for these restrictions to go through, he just won't vote for them. And I think that the idea that that's the kind of atmosphere that the public wants or will encourage the public to comply and to cooperate when there is disagreement between the main parties on these fundamental issues that can't be resolved in a sensible way, I think the public will be disappointed with that. And I will give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I'm grateful. Well, there might be a different interpretation of the events that we've just passed, mightn't there? Which is that a lot of us are very concerned that the Prime Minister doesn't give the full story to the House and to the nation. The truth is, we're almost certainly going to see another lockdown in January, aren't we? A full lockdown across the whole of the United Kingdom. The Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, I hear the Prime Minister say it's not what we want. Nobody wants any of this. Of course we don't, but we have to be honest and straightforward with the British people. And these measures today are not sufficient to the day.
I didn't hear my right honourable friend make the promise that he is suggesting that he made. I think my right honourable friend is being perfectly honest with the House on this. I think it's very difficult. I'll come to the point. But I want to concentrate on what we agree about. We all agree we want to keep the R rate below 1 while minimising the restrictions on people's lives and limiting the economic damage. If the R rate rises above 1, then this becomes much too difficult to predict and control. It has a multiplying effect even if the R rate remains constant. And it's perfectly legitimate for colleagues on this side to press the government for more clarity about why the government believes the NHS is at risk of being overwhelmed. Data for much of the country does not suggest that at the moment. But it's not uncommon for hospitals to become overrun during the winter months. That's without the addition of COVID. It's also reasonable for government to fear that the rising rate of COVID infections would lead to exactly that in some areas, or much worse, unless we can keep the R number around or below 1. And that's all that these measures can be expected to achieve. It's right to press the government for more analysis of the economic impact of these measures, but maybe the government was wrong to raise the expectation that they could provide this degree of certainty where so much uncertainty exists. Equally, it must be agreed it is impossible to predict the economic consequences of a rapid spread of the virus. And I understand the frustration of representing a low virus constituency, but included in a tier 2 area, and the need to provide the right support to business being badly hit. But these are not about alternatives to the fundamentals of this policy, which I believe the opposition is trying to avoid. The real question is, and it's also a legitimate question, is will these tiers be enough? I hope tier 2 will keep Essex below the R1, but there is doubt. Tier 2 did not work before. We must look upon this period as a further period of transition to when vaccines will begin to become available. We should look ahead at the challenges the vaccine programmes will present and give thought to how we will provide reassurance that the vaccine that you are being invited to accept is right for you. And in the meantime, the challenge is to ensure that we can move down the tiers, not just into tier 1, but to remain in tier 1, even if the vaccines take time to become effective and at scale. And this will depend upon how we all behave and the example that we set and what we do to encourage confidence and cooperation with test and trace operations. There is much to ask the government, which time does not allow today, about how to improve trace and isolate operations, particularly at local level, and about how the community volunteer hubs could help support people who should isolate. That is vital work now. The last thing I want is to vote for these restrictions today, but until there are better alternatives, we have no alternative and should support them. And I'm sorry that Her Majesty's opposition are trying to avoid that truth. The government has also the opportunity to learn by continuing to listen and to gain public confidence from that.
Patrick Grady.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The motions before the House
do relate exclusively to England, but that doesn't mean they don't have consequences across these islands. And so it is important, I think, that the voice of the Scottish National Party is heard in this debate. Although, in line with our long-standing practice, as regards matters that are devolved, we won't take part in any division this evening, and I'm sure that's of some assistance to the Government Whip's office. And perhaps the first thing the Government needs to consider is why it has got to that stage. Scotland has passed similar, but not identical, regulations with a far greater degree of cross-party and intra-party consensus than seems to have been managed here in Westminster. And perhaps that's because the First Minister and her Cabinet Secretaries and the senior public health officials have always taken a commendably frank and honest approach with the people of Scotland about the challenges of the virus and the difficulty of the decisions that have to be made. In the summertime, the First Minister initiated a national dialogue with people across Scotland on what a roadmap out of the initial lockdown should and could look like. Instead of promising moonshots and world-beating systems and that it would all be over by Christmas, the Scottish Government and the other devolved governments have worked to take people with them, whether that's the public at large or whether it's their own backbenchers. And we've always been clear that public health and saving lives has to be the priority. Whatever the pain, and there is real pain caused to the economy and livelihoods by these kind of restrictions, that pain is as nothing to a life ended too soon, to a family or a community bereaved by this dreadful disease. And as always, the Scottish National Party sends its deepest sympathies to all those who have lost a loved one as a result of the pandemic. But that's not to minimise the impact and effects of the economic pain. I see it firsthand in Glasgow North, which thrives on the hospitality and entertainment and events sector, and will be interested to find out what the consequences of the government's announcement today about support for pubs will be north of the border. My constituency is home to thousands of creatives, of startups, of entrepreneurs who have all been left behind, forgotten, excluded from the Chancellor's support package. We hear the impact from the families genuinely terrified that the £20 universal credit uplift will not be extended beyond March, and from those on legacy benefits who have yet to see a similar uplift. And we all feel the struggle of the frontline public sector workers busting a gut to keep the services that we all depend on going in the most difficult of circumstances. And support for all of these groups, and for those who need to isolate, which is absolutely critical to stopping the virus. In support for these groups, the government has been found wanting. And the Prime Minister was chuntering to the Leader of the Opposition, saying, how do we get people to self-isolate? Well, as he said, start by paying a decent rate of statutory sick pay. Make it affordable for people to stay at home and stay safe. And perhaps if the government had made more effort to support those people, to support the excluded, to support families who are struggling, then it wouldn't be feeling the heat that it is now from its own backbenches. And we just, Madam Deputy Speaker, need to compare that to what we've heard in the last few days in Scotland. A £500 bonus for all NHS and social care staff. For 10 weeks, we all clapped for carers, but that was never going to be enough. And this is a gesture of thanks for extraordinary service. And I really hope the Prime Minister and the Chancellor will have the decency not to level tax on this well-deserved reward. And for the families who need it most, a £100 one-off payment before Christmas to households with children in receipt of free school meals. And a commitment that all primary children will receive free meals, breakfast and lunch, at school and all year round if the SNP is re-elected next year. That's the difference that devolution makes. For NHS workers and families in receipt of these payments, that's not a disaster. That's a Scottish Government working for and delivering for their best interests and the interests of our society as a whole. And if it means that we're using our share of money that the UK Treasury has borrowed on Scotland's behalf, well, that's the point of devolution. And if the Tories don't like it, and I hear some chuntering, the solution is very simple. Independence for Scotland would have meant we could have raised our own finance on our own terms and spent it on our priorities in our own time. And we certainly would have had to wait for the south east of England to be placed into lockdown before the furlough scheme was extended across the whole of the UK. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, if the Prime Minister is feeling pressure from his own side today, he only has himself to blame. Real leadership is about being able to make the hard choices and be honest with people when mistakes are made, especially in a time of crisis. People don't want bluster and false hope. They want honesty and determination and empathy. The devolved governments have always sought a four nations approach wherever possible, and we've seen that agreement can be reached in the provisions being made for those who need to travel to see loved ones over Christmas. And while that period of easing will be welcomed by many, all of us will have an extra responsibility to be extra vigilant, to minimise risk, to practice social distance, our good hand hygiene, wearing our face coverings, and all the other steps that we've become familiar with. But that familiarity cannot become complacency. The threat of the virus to overwhelm our health service, to undermine the economy, and to individual lives across the country has not gone away. So while we welcome the light at the end of the tunnel, as vaccines come online, that light must be approached slowly and carefully. So that's why Scotland will continue with its tier system and the difficult decisions that we need until the virus is beaten. The other devolved nations are making similar decisions, and members representing England in this place have a responsibility to do likewise.
Sir Graham Brady.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I say at the outset that I think the Prime Minister's instincts in this matter are not so different from mine, and I recognise the difficulty and the burden that he carries. This is a difficult matter, and there are difficult decisions to take. Freedom, Madam Deputy Speaker, is not an absolute, but it should be regarded as precious. And it should be always the strongest possible presumption in its favour. If government is to take away fundamental liberties of the people whom we represent, they must demonstrate beyond question that they are acting in a way that is both proportionate and absolutely necessary. Today, Madam Deputy Speaker, I believe the government has failed to make that compelling case. The benefit of the doubt that this House has extended to government in March and since is harder to take for granted in December. Madam Deputy Speaker, 6 weeks ago, many of us made the case that the curfew policy at 10 p.m. was not just unnecessary, but that it was counterproductive. Today, the government apparently agrees that the 10 p.m. curfew makes no sense. A month ago, the government insisted that golf and tennis and bowls and gyms were unsafe. Now, it seems that they are not. Madam Deputy Speaker, before the second lockdown, I invited the House to consider whether government had the right to make it illegal for people to see their children, their grandchildren, or their elderly relatives, whether government had the right to ban collective worship or to take away the right to work to support your family. Different people, different members of this House, will draw the line in different places. But we must all accept that these are fundamental freedoms of our constituents, and we should insist on compelling evidence before we allow them to be compromised. That is why, Madam Deputy Speaker, I asked for an impact assessment a month ago, and also for a transparent publication of the criteria that would be used to decide in which tier our constituents would be placed, but also, crucially, the weighting that would be applied to each of those criteria. Madam Deputy Speaker, my constituents in the Borough of Trafford have been placed unfairly in Tier 3, in spite of COVID test figures that are well below the average for England. Currently, the rate is 127.7 per 100,000 and falling rapidly. But I looked in vain at the document published late yesterday for any explanation or any route being set out as to how we would reach that low tier. There was no serious attempt in that document to provide an answer. In the absence of that serious and compelling case, Madam Deputy Speaker, I have no choice but to oppose these measures.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would say to the Right Honourable Gentleman for Altrincham and Sale West that this debate is indeed about freedom, but it's also about the balance of risks and costs. The risks to life and the costs to businesses and families, which are both substantial and deeply worrying to every single member of this House. But it's also a debate about facts. What are the facts? And here we know that our debate in this country, and indeed across the world, about how to handle this epidemic is disputed by some. And it is a dispute in which the truth and the uncertainty, because some of this is all about scientific uncertainty, wrestle with the plainly false. And it is about the impact of that on vaccination that I want to say a few words today. For months now, we have lived through restrictions. We have seen people die. We have seen our local businesses suffer. And from time to time, we have lifted our eyes to the horizon in the hope of glimpsing something that is a bit better. Well, something has now appeared. To use a seasonal analogy, in the dark winter sky, there are 3 new stars have appeared, and they are the 3 new vaccines which have been developed and are awaiting approval. And as has been said already, every single one of us owes an enormous debt of gratitude to the scientists and the volunteers who took part, and to all of the people in the NHS, local authorities, our forces and others who, as we speak, are making preparation for the mass vaccination programme to come. But that too is disputed by some people, although I think it's really important, Madam Deputy Speaker, we distinguish between the conspiracy theorist anti-vaxxers on the one hand and those who have genuine questions and concerns on the other. Now, it may seem incredible to every single one of us that there are people who believe those conspiracy theories, one of which apparently is that governments wish to inject us all with microchips. Given the problems there have been with handling other aspects of the epidemic, I don't think any government of the world would have the capability to do that. It is, of course, complete nonsense, but more seriously, we remember the huge anxiety that was caused by the false claim that autism was caused by the MMR vaccine. Now, that study was eventually discredited, the doctor responsible struck off, but the damage had been done, and the anti-vax conspiracy theorists are still touting their lethal wares around the internet. The fact is that vaccination has saved millions and millions of lives since Edward Jenner developed the first successful vaccine in 1796. And in the last 30 years, vaccination against polio has almost eradicated that terrible disease. There are just 2 countries left in the world where it still exists, Pakistan and Afghanistan, and that is in part down to some people who have killed brave health workers who were only trying to save the lives of children. And therefore, anything and everything, and I say this to the Health Secretary, that can be done to take on those who spread falsehoods will have the full support of this House. But it is also a fact that there are people who have genuine questions and concerns. And I just say it's really important that we provide as much information as possible so people can weigh up the facts, talk to their GPs and make a decision. Now, I welcome the decision that vaccination will not be compulsory. It should not be compulsory. But nor should we forget that it is both a fact and the truth that the more of us who are vaccinated, the better the chance we have of defeating this disease. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, subject to the regulators saying they are safe, I, for one, will be queuing with my sleeve rolled up when the time comes.
David Davis.